soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force. You are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
Throughout the history of the United States, enemies have arose to challenge American values. These enemies have challenged the U.S. on political, economic, military, and technological ideals. While these enemies have been difficult to overcome, America always prevails. The American experience has been embodied by a constant struggle in the pursuit of democratic ideals, prosperity, and the desire to create a better future.
It seems only fitting that a nation of democratic ideals and a righteous obsession with the idea of freedom and liberty for all would be warned from a reign of tyranny and social injustices. At its genesis, America was simply a collection of colonies under rule of the British Crown, and loyal colonies they remained until the Crown began taking advantage of these colonies and their citizens, treating them as though they were not, as promised, British citizens. This created outrage throughout the New World, which continued to grow through various injustices until it reached its breaking point. If the colonists were refused the rights guaranteed to all British citizens, then they must not be British citizens, meaning this collection of colonies, in the words of Richard Henry Lee, are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Under the leadership and direction of famous colonial leaders such as George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, these colonists created a document known as the Declaration of Independence, declaring once and for all their individual sovereignty as a new nation. This declaration sparked a bloody war between the global superpower of Great Britain and the inexperienced, poorly armed colonies. After many years of fighting, the colonists secured their victory over Great Britain and earned their place in the world as a new nation. This new nation was built upon the ideas of independence for all, civil liberties, and basic rights for all people, as stated in the famous document that changed the face of the world.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
The aftermath of the American Revolution yielded freedom from the repression of British colonial rule and promised certain unalienable rights for Americans, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, millions of Americans remained in bondage under the institution of slavery. Slaves were considered property and had little to no opportunity to exercise the rights supposedly guaranteed to them as Americans. Soldiers, black and white, would fight in the Civil War to combat this injustice. The war was drawn out and bloody, costing hundreds of thousands of American lives. However, those who perished did not die in vain. The agony of the Civil War was redeemed by the freeing of slaves and protection of the natural rights of millions of people. In his Emancipation Proclamation speech, Abraham Lincoln stated the following:
"And by virtue of the power and the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare all persons held as slaves within said designated states and part of states are and henceforward shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons.
By the 1930s, the United States was marked by problems both domestically and globally as the nation struggled to maintain its economic and political holdings as a nation. Already going through a Great Depression that ruined the U.S. economy in the early 1930s, political turmoil in Europe resulted in the rise of authoritarian regimes like Fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and Imperial Japan. The attempt of hostile takeover by these countries would result in the single largest war of the 20th century, World War II. Although the United States was at first neutral, the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 changed everything. After the attack, President Roosevelt defined the future struggle of the United States entering the war and what effort would be needed.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
From the decision to go to war against Germany and Japan, the United States would not only fight a war of freedom, but a war of democracy, a war of the destruction of tyranny and injustice, a war of different ideologies. The defeat of Nazi Germany in April 1945 and the drop of the atomic bombs on Japan in August 1945, the United States would win the struggle of freedom and democracy and become a global power on an unprecedented scale. However, within 5 years, another war would occur, only this one would be fought without firing a single shot.
From the end of World War II until the late 1980s, the United States was embroiled in an economic and political struggle with the Soviet Union, the Cold War. However, this strife took on a new dimension on October 4, 1957, when the USSR launched the first artificial satellite into space, Sputnik, on top of a retrofitted ICBM. The United States scurried to catch up to the Soviets. After many failed attempts, the Americans were able to launch their own satellite into orbit, Explorer 1, on top of an ICBM. In the beginning of the space race, the Soviets beat America at every turn. The Soviets had the first artificial satellite, the first man in space, and the first spacewalk. Undaunted, President John F. Kennedy gave a speech in Texas challenging Americans to make it to the moon.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Slowly but surely, Americans overtook the Soviets. Americans matched the Soviets with their own spacewalk. In the process of staying in space for 2 weeks, Americans had the first rendezvous and proved how to work effectively in space. Despite a fire that killed 3 crew members and halted the U.S. space program for a year, Apollo 8 brought the first humans to lunar orbit in 1968. And on July 21, 1969, America won the space race.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
On September 11, 2001, America was thrown into a new struggle, a struggle against terror. The attacks cost the United States thousands of American lives. The perpetrator of the attack was found to be the terrorist leader, Osama bin Laden. In the months to come, Afghanistan was invaded by the US to fight a war on terror. The goal of the war was to overthrow the Taliban regime in Afghanistan and to capture bin Laden. The new war was the US's attempt to keep itself safe from any outside threats. This can be summed up by President Bush's speech at West Point.
We must stay on the offensive. We must be determined and we must be relentless to do our duty to protect the American people from harm.
Eventually, President Bush was able to overthrow the regime, but was not able to capture bin Laden. the US had successfully defended itself from any further terrorist attacks for the time being. The peace would be short-lived due to a new declaration of war against Iraq. According to President Bush, the war was waged in an attempt to capture weapons of mass destruction from Iraq. No nuclear weapons were found, but what did occur as a result of the war was the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and the subsequent fall of Iraq into a state of constant civil unrest. President Bush's decision to attack Iraq was a very controversial one, but one that was born in an effort to protect the US at any cost. This period of time in US history was another of struggle, but one that showed US authority in preventing any threat to it, no matter how catastrophically real or falsely perceived.
Throughout American history, there has been a constant struggle for the continuation and advancement of American values. From the founding of our country to the bitter war between the states to combating terrorism on a global level, an enemy has always arose to challenge the United States. While these enemies become better at undermining American values, the United States always overcomes these adversities, and when the challenges are great, it makes it all the more gratifying when we reach our goals.
The United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, and a terrorist who's responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children.